one of the most important things in global financial market is the renminbi's role will just increase. And actually one thing very important is this about global reserve currency system. So Chinese yuan could be convertible and then can be used by many other central banks as their reserve currencies.
Of course, earlier on, our top headline story was Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong in Beijing trying to improve ties in a range of areas from trade to human rights to the global international order.
Earlier on our top headline story was Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong in Beijing trying to improve ties in a range of areas from trade to human rights to the global international order. One of the most important things in the global financial market is the renminbi. Is this about the global reserve currency system? So, the Chinese yuan could be convertible and then can be used by many other central banks as their reserve currencies. Headlines across the world are beginning to reveal a possibility that once sounded impossible. Australia, long considered one of Washington's most loyal allies in the Pacific, is quietly weighing a move toward the BRICS alliance. This isn't rumor passed through back channels, but reporting from respected outlets like the Financial Times, The Guardian Australia, and Politico, each citing sources close to the talks. Inside Canberra, debates are intensifying as more voices question whether clinging to American leadership still delivers value. The spark came from growing friction with Washington, fueled by Donald Trump's tariff policies, which left many Australian leaders rethinking their path forward. Could this be the start of a realignment that redraws global power maps? And if so, what comes next? When the United States extended its trade war beyond China and turned its attention to allies, Australia was among the first to feel the sting. Tariffs on aluminum, steel, and key agricultural exports struck at the heart of an economy built on trade, shaking confidence in the reliability of Washington's partnership. In Canberra, the Albanese government began to split into two camps. Some officials argued that loyalty to the long-standing American alliance should remain the foundation of Australian foreign policy. Others saw a new reality emerging, one where leaning toward strategic independence and strengthening ties with China, India, and Russia looked less like a gamble and more like a path to survival. That internal divide widened when Donald Trump made it clear during a Fox News interview that America would no longer babysit its allies. To Australian ears, those words sounded less like policy and more like disdain, sparking widespread resentment. Meanwhile, Beijing saw an opening. Chinese diplomats began pressing harder in Canberra, offering concessions that Washington seemed unwilling to consider. Preferential trade deals, investment guarantees, and infrastructure partnerships were laid on the table as part of the expanding BRICS Plus framework. Officially, these proposals were framed as opportunities for growth and cooperation. But beneath the surface, they represented a calculated effort to pull Australia away from its Western orbit. The implications were enormous. If Canberra were to tilt toward BRICS, the United States would lose one of its most valuable allies in the Pacific, a development that could upend decades of carefully built security architecture. Economists at the Lowy Institute pointed out that such a shift might not be as far-fetched as it once seemed. The numbers spoke for themselves. More than a third of Australia's exports already flowed to China, from iron ore to agricultural produce. When Washington imposed new tariffs, Beijing quickly stepped in to purchase more, offering favorable terms that underscored the contrast between the two powers. China stepped in when Australia needed partners, while America tightened its grip. This shift did not go unnoticed in the business community. The Australian Aluminium Council issued a stark warning that American tariffs threatened jobs and placed long-standing partnerships at risk. The reaction inside Washington was one of alarm. Reports in the Washington Post revealed that Trump's advisors were scrambling to craft emergency measures to keep Australia close. They floated options ranging from diplomatic overtures to expanded military agreements under the AUKUS framework. Yet the effectiveness of those moves was increasingly questioned in Canberra. Military guarantees had once been viewed as the strongest anchor of the alliance. But in an era of rising tensions with China, they began to look like liabilities. Senior defense officials voiced private concerns. If conflict broke out between Washington and Beijing, would Australia automatically become a target? This very question began surfacing in closed parliamentary hearings, revealing how deeply the debate had cut into the nation's security establishment. Beijing's offers were not limited to rhetoric. Chinese-backed infrastructure proposals began multiplying. From port expansions to rail systems designed to integrate Australia more deeply into Asia's trade networks, Reports from Australian outlets described quiet meetings between Chinese state banks and major financial institutions in Sydney and Melbourne, part of a larger push to weave Australia into a new economic bloc centered on Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi. For Washington, this scenario was more than unsettling. Rand Corporation analysts warned that losing Australia would undermine America's strategy of containing China in the Indo-Pacific, where Australia had long hosted critical U.S. bases and surveillance facilities. Without that cornerstone, the entire regional framework could collapse. Despite these dangers, Trump continued to double down on his tariff-driven approach, insisting that allies contribute more to their partnerships with the United States. The problem was that this rhetoric no longer inspired loyalty but resentment. Australia, once firmly rooted in the Western camp, began looking eastward with growing interest. Analysts like Rory Medcalf observed that if Washington failed to adapt, Canberra could become the first Western state to formally align with BRICS. What began as an attempt to punish China risked pushing allies directly into Beijing's arms. Beijing strategy relied less on confrontation and more on quiet persuasion. Instead of demanding loyalty, China offered investment, cultural cooperation, and long-term economic integration. Reports from Nikkei Asia described massive initiatives already underway. From renewable energy projects to joint research centers linking Chinese firms with Australian universities. These ventures were portrayed as forward-looking partnerships, but they also created dependencies that would be difficult to unravel. Simultaneously, Chinese media began amplifying narratives that cast Australia as an independent power capable of leading in the Southern Pacific rather than living in America's shadow. Public opinion was not immune to this influence. According to Reuters, Chinese envoys reached out to trade unions and industry associations, promising secure contracts for Australian workers if the country deepened ties with BRICS. Such moves reframed the debate as more than a diplomatic question. It became about livelihoods, jobs, and the future of the Australian workforce. Analysts at the Australian Financial Review warned that Beijing's offer was not simply about trade. It was about reshaping the global resources market. Australia, they argued, was being invited to supply the raw materials and energy needed to power BRICS economies, effectively giving Canberra a ticket into the club of nations positioned to dominate future resource flows. Even India, historically a complicated partner for Australia, signaled support. Reporting from The Hindu highlighted New Delhi's view that Australia's entry into BRICS could strengthen the bloc's southern flank and position India as a mediator between Canberra and Beijing. That role would give India added influence in shaping a new world order. For Australia, the potential benefits looked increasingly tangible. While the risks of staying tethered to Washington under Trump's confrontational trade policy grew more obvious, inside Washington, anxiety deepened. The Wall Street Journal reported that the National Security Council had circulated assessments exploring what a partial loss of Australia might mean. These documents warned of cascading effects. If Canberra broke ranks, other nations such as New Zealand and the Philippines might eventually follow. What began as a rift over tariffs could spread into a broader realignment of alliances across the Pacific. The irony was difficult to miss. America's protectionist turn aimed at defending its own economy was driving away its closest partners and accelerating the rise of its rivals. If Washington failed to act, the world could soon witness a fundamental reshaping of international relations. BRICS, long viewed as a coalition of developing economies, could evolve into a rival center of power, one with Australia as its western bridgehead. Beijing understood this better than anyone. Its campaign to pull Australia closer relied on steady long-term commitments that would bind the two economies together. Infrastructure investments, cultural partnerships, and trade concessions were all part of a carefully orchestrated strategy. In Canberra, the question was no longer whether China's approach was appealing, but whether resisting it remained realistic. For a country caught between loyalty to an old ally and opportunity with a rising one, the stakes could not be higher. What makes this unfolding story even more significant is how it exposes the unintended consequences of America's trade war. By targeting allies alongside rivals, Washington sent a signal that loyalty carried no protection. That message, received loud and clear in Canberra, created space for Beijing to present itself as a dependable alternative. With every new tariff, the grip of the American alliance weakened and the pull of BRICS grew stronger for the United States. The implications go beyond economics. Australia has long been a linchpin in America's Indo-Pacific strategy, hosting military facilities that provide intelligence, surveillance, and strategic reach. If that bond frays, Washington loses more than a trade partner, it loses a critical pillar of its global power. Yet for Australia, the calculus is shifting toward pragmatism. Economic lifelines, jobs, and long-term stability may outweigh historical loyalty, particularly if Washington continues to prioritize domestic politics over allied interests. As events accelerate, experts warn that the coming months could decide the outcome. If Washington fails to reassert its value, Canberra may be drawn irreversibly into Beijing's orbit. That would mark one of the most dramatic shifts in international relations in decades, transforming BRICS from an informal bloc into a powerful alternative order with Australia as its symbolic breakthrough into the Western world. Thus, a paradox is unfolding in its drive to punish China. America is inadvertently pushing its own allies into Beijing's embrace. If this process is not halted in the coming months, the world may witness the most significant geopolitical shift in decades. Moreover, in the latest developments, Donald Trump's reported suspension of $400 million in weapons aid to Taiwan has rattled both Washington and Taipei, sparking speculation that the island may have been reduced to a bargaining chip in the larger trade struggle with China. The pause, if confirmed, covered lethal munitions and autonomous drones, though sources suggested it could still be reversed. The Washington Post revealed that the timing was no coincidence, coming on the heels of renewed U.S. efforts to secure a trade deal with Beijing and only hours before Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping spoke directly over the phone. That conversation, described by Trump as productive, touched on fentanyl, TikTok, and tariffs, with both leaders agreeing to meet in Korea in October and for Trump to make a state visit the following year. Yet, what stood out most was what went unspoken. Taiwan, Beijing's most sensitive issue and one of the sharpest flashpoints in U.S.-China relations, did not appear in either side's official readout. For Beijing, the island is non-negotiable, destined to fall under its control by peaceful means or force. For Taiwan's 23 million citizens, the rejection of Communist Party rule has only hardened over time, fueling one of the most tense military standoffs in the world. Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, responded by warning that the island's peace depends on deterrence, calling for stronger defense capabilities and resilience through constant preparation. Since 2022, U.S. presidents have been authorized by Congress to provide up to $1 billion annually in weapons from American stockpiles divided between Taiwan and Ukraine. During Trump's first term, sales to Taiwan exceeded $10 billion, the highest level since the 1990s. Yet, in his second term, enthusiasm has cooled. Trump has publicly questioned whether American taxpayers should foot the bill for Taiwan security, suggesting that the island should pay for protection and moving away from security aid toward traditional sales. This shift was felt most acutely at a major defense exhibition in Taipei, where arms manufacturers displayed their latest technology only to find themselves fielding anxious questions about Washington's intentions. Attendees described how company representatives scrambled for information after the pause became public, revealing just how unexpected the development had been. Taipei's government offered a carefully worded response, declining to confirm the reports, but insisting that Washington has historically supported its defense needs. Analysts weighed in with varying interpretations. William Young of Crisis Group suggested the move was tactical, with Trump temporarily softening his stance on Taiwan to extract better terms from Beijing. Yet he cautioned that such pauses create vulnerabilities that China can exploit, potentially turning temporary concessions into a permanent weakening of U.S. resolve. Others echoed similar concerns. Craig Singleton of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies argued that Beijing views symbolic gestures on fentanyl or technology restrictions as sufficient currency if they lead to relief on tariffs and a softer line on Taiwan. Amanda Siao of Eurasia Group added that while support for Taipei was unlikely to disappear altogether, the shape of that support may change, with arms sales and symbolic acts likely to resume only after Trump's high-profile visit to Beijing. These developments unfolded alongside a broader trade story. Trump's renewed escalation of tariffs has revived memories of the first phase of the U.S.-China trade war in 2018. But this time, the impact on shipping patterns has been far more dramatic. Companies eager to stay ahead of tariff hikes rushed to import goods from China before deadlines took effect, a phenomenon known as front-loading. Data from Import Genius shows that in 2025, importers pulled forward shipments at more than twice the rate seen at the height of the 2018 trade war. And if this process is not halted in the coming months, the world may witness the most significant geopolitical shift in decades.